So we're going through our study in the book of Genesis, and we come to this passage here, and this may be very familiar to many of us. This is the story of God creating not just Adam, but then creating Eve and forming this first initial human family unit. And the title for the sermon today, Community as God Designed It. This is the base and the core of human community. And what it is it's family. I think it was, I don't often quote Margaret Thatcher, but I'm going to today. She said, "There's no such thing as society. There's only individuals and families." And there might be something to that. There might be something to that idea. When you really think about it, it's just individuals and families. And here, God is establishing this initial core unit of the human family. And with this, we have the first wedding. Now, some of you guys are up here with us today because of a wedding, so this is fitting. I didn't really plan that at all. It just so happened, or maybe God sort of planned that we would be in this text. But that's what we're going to look at today. And there's a couple things that you're going to notice as we've gone through our study in Genesis. The Bible has this incredible symmetry to it. So what I mean by that is there are things that we see in Genesis that we also see at the very end in Revelation. So think about the garden. We see that show up again at the end of Revelation. The tree of life is talked about again at the end of Revelation. And then even this concept of marriage, it shows up here in Genesis 2, and then it shows up again in Revelation. And in that instance, it is the marriage supper of the Lamb. That's this unifying and this celebration and this party that we are looking forward to, that human history is leading to, where Jesus finally is united forever with his bride, the church. And so, as we consider this, we're going to take a look at some of the text here today. If we look at, and I'm going to call this, as we call this in weddings, it's the giveaway. So it's a point in the service very early on in a typical Christian wedding where the father will walk the bride down the aisle and present her to her new husband or soon-to-be husband, the groom. And in Genesis, God is the one who presents Eve for the first time to Adam. He's not only presiding over the service, but he's also bringing her to him. And it's incredible because the first thing that Adam says, he immediately, when he sees Eve, he becomes a poet. Right off the bat, he says, "This is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man." This is the first sort of piece of art, if you think about, when Adam sees Eve for the first time. And oftentimes in our text it says, it might say, "This is now," but it's much more exclamatory than that. Adam is saying, "At last, at last." There is a longing there that God allowed Adam to experience before he brought Eve to him. And when he says "at last," what is he? This is what he has been waiting for. And you could say, well, he's been waiting for this his whole life, which, well, I guess wasn't very long at that point. But I find it fascinating that God did delay in creating Eve, because whenever he created animals and everything else, apparently he just created them as pairs at the same time. But with Adam, it was a bit different. He created Adam a specific way, and we talked about that last week. And then there was a delay before he created Eve and brought Eve and presented her to him. This is when Adam sees Eve, and when he says that she is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, she will be called woman because she was taken out of man. he's recognizing a couple of things. He's recognizing that she is like me, but she is also distinct from me. She's different. She's very different from me, but she is the suitable pair, which we're going to talk more about, that he was waiting for and anticipating and longing for. Now, I have to mention here, and I find this fascinating, that Adam at this moment had everything that he needed. I mean, he had a perfect relationship with the Father, and he was in paradise. I mean, he was put in this garden. He had everything, and yet there's something lacking. And that's an interesting thing to think about, because it even states that it was not good that man should be alone. And this is following a poetic series of God saying, it is good, it is good, it is good. At the end, he said, it is very good when he looked at all of his creation. And then he says, it is not good that man should be alone. Now, there's something here that I think is important for us to distinguish. And that is that there is a certain place that our spouses, our significant others are supposed to have with us. And there's a danger in making this other person something that they're never supposed to be. So, for instance, there were certain needs that Adam needed fulfilled on a human-to-human level that God allowed for another being to fill that need. I've told this little story before, but I think it's fitting for us. There was one night, there was a little family, and they were a husband and wife, and they have a little child. And the child was asleep in his room, very young, and he gets awoken in the middle of the night by a really bad lightning storm. And he comes running in, and he jumps in between mom and dad, and he's afraid. And they comfort him, and they reassure him that it's going to be okay. And wisely they tell him, even though you were in there alone, you're not really alone because God's with you. God's with you. And that was a good teachable moment for the parents to teach their child that, yeah, God's everywhere. He's always with you. But the child responded this way. The child said, yes, but right now I need someone with skin on. Right now, he needed a human being. And parents are put into that role for that purpose. Yes, God is enough. But God also allowed for the creation of not just husband and wife, but also for the perpetuation of families with children. And the reality is, children need parents. They need that. They have to have that. And with that comes this risk for us. The risk is we cannot put this other person into a position of fulfilling the needs that we have that only God can fulfill. And this can happen very subtly. If you start looking to this other person to satisfy some of your deepest needs that only God himself can satisfy, that's a recipe for disaster for that relationship. Because you're putting that person in an impossible situation. They cannot live up to those kind of expectations. And it's the same thing with children and parents. If you think of the story of Abraham and Isaac, even before God gave Abraham the gift of his son Isaac, we see this longing in Abraham. He tells God, actually God is in Genesis 15, God says to him, I am your shield and I am your exceedingly great reward. He's saying to Abraham, I am everything to you. And Abraham's response, more or less, is, yeah, are you going to give me a son? And so you get this glimpse of there is this temptation. Even before Isaac was born, there was a temptation that Isaac was going to take the place in Abraham's heart and mind that only God should occupy. There's a certain space there. And so what happened? Well, later on, God made Abraham choose. He had to choose between Isaac and him. And praise be to God, Abraham was faithful. He chose to obey God even at the potential expense of his son, and he got both. If he would have chosen Isaac in place of God, then he would have gotten neither. And we see this mistake made in Adam and Eve in chapter 3, because what Adam does effectively is he chooses Eve over God, and it's to the detriment of everyone. So there's a warning here. And now, for those of you visiting with us, I can't go a Sunday without quoting C.S. Lewis, so you're welcome. You get to enjoy that. C.S. Lewis put it this way. He said, "It's probably impossible to love any human too much. You may love him or her too much in proportion to your love for God. But it is the smallness of your love for God, not the greatness of your love for the person, that constitutes the inordinacy." So it's not that we can love other things more than God. We should love other things, and especially our spouses. We should love them so incredibly much. But we should also love God far more than we love anything or anyone else. Now, there's something here. Actually, I want to mention. You might be wondering, well, what does the Bible say about singleness? Real briefly, I want to say, now this is wonderful because the Apostle Paul addresses this. He essentially tells us that if you are married, then he lays out what this relationship can look like and should look like to glorify God. And then he also says if you're single, that's great too. Here's what singleness can look like to glorify God. And it's not that you have to seek one or the other. A lot of it has to do with contentment. You never want to get into a relationship or a situation out of discontentment, because again, you're setting yourself up for failure. There ought not be this desperation of I have to have this other person. No, it's all of my needs, my core needs are met by God, but I am better with this other person. I love this other person. I want to be with them. Now, in verse 18, let's take a look at this, because this is really fascinating what God says here. Then God said, "It is not good that man should be alone. I will make a helper suitable for him." Some of your versions might say something a little bit different there. I think the King James says helpmeet, which is an interesting thing to say. There's two words here. The word for helper is the word azer, and it literally means desperately needed military aid. That's what the word means. Powerful, intense aid that is needed. This kind of helper. And it's used elsewhere in Scripture being that. Imagine a small military force that is about to be overwhelmed and destroyed. They are in desperate need of an azer, a military force, a strong force to come in and rescue them. That's the word that God uses here. Now, interestingly, it's also used of God himself, azer. He is this divine helper that comes in and brings the salvation when needed, powerfully. Now that's interesting. And the English rendering of that, it just seems a little bit weak, helper. God isn't creating someone just to do your laundry. That's not what this is about at all. This is a divine sort of helper. Now, there's actually two words, azer, and then your versions might say suitable for him or something along those lines. But the phrase is ezer kenegdo. Now this is really strange for us because the word kenegdo, it means like opposite. Like opposite, or a helper opposed. And that sounds so strange. Unless you've been married for like 10 minutes and you're like, that actually makes a lot of sense. That it's not a helper exactly like you. And this goes both directions. You realize that men and women are incredibly different. And we're, of course, alike in a lot of ways, but we're also, imagine puzzle pieces. If you had two puzzle pieces that were exactly the same shape, guess what? They're not going to go so well together. They're supposed to be mirror images. They're supposed to be this complementary opposite so that they can function together. And so in marriage, you have two people who are alike in their humanity and value, but are very different, very distinct in their capabilities and in desires, and even just their hard wiring. We just think differently. We process differently. And that's okay. That's the way God designed it. And then what marriage is God taking these two equal opposites and putting them together in this incredibly close, intimate relationship. How close? Well, it says here, one flesh. Pretty close. Pretty close. And the word here for flesh might not be what you think. When God says, I will pour out my spirit on all flesh, he doesn't just mean all bodies, he means all persons, right? That we are to share the same space, same possessions, raising children together, working on a common goal together. There is a unity of life that takes place, and that's the way God intended it. And you're going to have headbutting. You're going to have headbutting. That's the nature of it. I once heard this example, and this is good. I often use this. Imagine two rough gems that you just discovered. You dug out of the ground, and you put them together in a rock tumbler. And what do? They knock into each other over and over and over again. And they slowly will knock the rough edges off, and they become smooth. That's essentially what marriage is. You're going to have this. You're going to have some friction, and that's okay. That's a good thing. And of course, there's right ways and wrong ways to go about that. But don't have your expectations such that there shouldn't be any conflict. Well, I've done enough marriage counseling, premarital counseling, and weddings to tell you that when couples say, we never fight, we've never had a disagreement, I always think to myself, okay, that means one person is getting their way and one person isn't. That's often what that means. And so I'm like, okay. Now, I'm not saying you should go home and fight, not at all. But just understand that you're not the same, and you're not going to be the same, and that's okay. You weren't supposed to be the same. Now, I have to give a warning here. Our society is such that everything that we do, it seems, is viewed through a consumer-type mentality. So we evaluate everything on a cost-reward basis. And that kind of idea can easily creep into dating and into marriage. And so we look at it like, well, as long as I'm getting more out of it than I'm putting in, then that's good. Well, that is much more of a contract than it is a covenant. Now, if you think about this, marriages are supposed to be covenants. Covenants, the difference between a covenant and a contract, contracts are based in distrust. That's why they exist. Whereas covenants are completely based in trust. That is what they are supposed to be. Now, they share some similarities. There's boundaries and there's expectations. but they are completely different. Completely different. There's an individual by the name of Gary Thomas who wrote a book called Sacred Marriage. And in that he says, the purpose of marriage is not to make you happy, it's to make you holy. Now that sounds kind of unromantic, but think about that. The purpose of marriage is not to make you happy, it's to make you holy. I think there's a lot of truth in that. And that doesn't mean that you won't be happy, but you have to address the purpose of it at the outset. You have to know what you're getting into and what to expect out of this. There's a retired professor he was at Duke Divinity School by the name of Stanley Hauerwas. He's kind of a crotchety old guy now. But he said this, and I think he's exactly right. He said, destructive to marriage is the self-fulfillment ethic that assumes marriage and the family are primarily institutions of personal fulfillment, necessary for us to become whole and happy. The assumption is that there is someone just right for us to marry, and that if we look close enough, we will find the right person. This moral assumption overlooks a crucial aspect of marriage. It fails to appreciate the fact that we always marry the wrong person. We never know who we marry, we just think we do. Or even if we first marry the right person, just give it a little time and he or she will change. For marriage, being the enormous thing it is, means that we are not the same person after we have entered it. The primary problem is learning how to love and care for the stranger to whom we find ourselves married. That's interesting. That's an interesting perspective. But the reality is, because God made us different, and the fact that people don't stay static, we change, right? We're always changing. And life circumstances and various things can mold us and to cause us to change in life. And so marriage is not, I promise to love you today. It's a promise to love you tomorrow and the next day and the next day. And that assumes, well, there might be a lot of changes, but I'm here. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. We see this marital language throughout the Old Testament, and this is why this is so important. Why in the world would God invent something like this? And I have to think it's so that, lesser things aside, we can ultimately understand our relationship with God better and his relationship with us. Throughout the Old Testament, God uses marital type language where he refers to himself as the bridegroom and to his people as the bride. And then, of course, that comes to fruition in the New Testament with the church being his bride. And God is jealous. God is jealous. And that is something that we think of oftentimes as being a bad thing. Well, for us, it can be a bad thing. And I suppose there's different types of jealousy. But for God, everything belongs to him, especially his people. He's in covenant with his people. And so whenever they behave in such a way, like for instance, when Israel would go outside of the relationship with God to look for protection, when they would make alliances with other nations to provide protection, God looked at that as, this is spiritual adultery, because you're going outside of this relationship to look for something that I promised to provide to you. And so we see God almost, it seems, overreacting to things at times in the Old Testament. But the reality is he is jealous for us. He is jealous. And if you think of it like in those terms, God is in the longest lived, worst marriage in the history of the world. We're told in John chapter 1 that he came unto his own, and his own received him not. But as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God. Do you see the invitation there? It reminds me of a parable that Jesus told about inviting people to a dinner, to a celebration, and people didn't come. The people who were invited didn't come. And so what did he do? The man told his servants to just go out and invite anyone who wants to come. Come in. Come in. The invitation is there. And ultimately, if you think of it again along these lines, God was crucified by his spouse. Think about that. He made himself that vulnerable, knowing full well what was going to take place. And as we approach the Christmas season, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about God taking on flesh, God taking on everything that it is to be a human being, and that includes vulnerability. That's incredible. He loved so dearly and so desperately that he was willing to put on flesh and to be born in a, well, not a great circumstance. When you look at, and as weeks approaching Christmas, we're going to look at the circumstances that Jesus came into. And it was not good circumstances. But he stepped into this world, and he did so knowing full well what it was going to cost him. And he was willing to pay that price anyway. God doesn't love us because we are lovely. He loves us because it's who he is. I want to share as we close here today. Excuse me, my throat's a little bit froggy, as you can tell. I'm going to share a parable. This isn't a parable from the Bible. This is another story parable. I've told this before. It's called The King and the Maiden. And I want you to think about this. This is depicting from God's perspective what it was like to love a human being. The King and the Maiden. And this is by the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard, if anybody was interested in that. It says, suppose there was a king who loved a humble maiden. The king was like no other king. Every statesman trembled at his power. No one dared breathe a word against him, for he had the strength to crush all opponents. And yet, this mighty king was melted by love for a humble maiden who lived in a poor village in his kingdom. How could he declare his love for her? In an odd sort of way, his kingliness tied his hands. If he brought her to the palace and crowned her head with jewels and clothed her body in royal robes, she would surely not resist. No one dared resist him. But would she love him? She would say she loved him, of course. But would she truly? Or would she live with him in fear, nursing a private grief for the life she had left behind? Would she be happy at his side? How could he know for sure? If he rode into her forest cottage in his royal carriage with an armed escort waving bright banners, that too would overwhelm her. He did not want a cringing subject. He wanted a lover, an equal. He wanted her to forget that he was a king and she a humble maiden, and to let shared love cross the gulf between them. For it is only in love that the unequal can be made equal. The king, convinced he could not elevate the maiden without crushing her freedom, resolved to descend to her. Clothed as a beggar, he approached her cottage with a worn cloak fluttering loose about him. This was not just a disguise. the king took on a totally new identity. He had renounced his throne to declare his love and win hers. That's the gospel in story form. That's incredible. If you think about it, the all-powerful creator of the universe loves us so dearly that he was willing to give up everything so that we might have a relationship with him, a relationship that wasn't based on coercion or fear, but one that was based solely on seeing the love that he has for us and responding to it. That's incredible. That's incredible. And so this idea of marriage, as God lays it out here for us in Genesis 2, it was his idea. He invented it, and he defines it. And it is ultimately this way in which we get to participate in his love for all of us. That's an incredible thing. I'm going to go ahead and close us in prayer this morning. Dear good and gracious God, I thank you for this love that you have for us. God, I ask that you would impress this upon each and every one of us, that we might see, even if for the first time, that you did everything that you could to make a way that we could be in a relationship with you. I thank you so much for that. I thank you for the gift of marriage that you've given to us. And I ask that you would continually teach us more and more of who you are and what this relationship is to look like. And these things I pray in the precious name of Jesus the Christ. Amen.